There's a deal that shaped everything you've ever bought, every war you've ever watched on the news, every election that confused you, every price spike that hit your wallet without warning. You never signed it. Nobody asked you, but you've been living inside it your entire life. It was made in the summer of 1974, in secret, between two governments that, on paper, had every reason to distrust each other. And what they agreed to, in a few quiet rooms far from any camera, rewired the entire global economy for the next 50 years.
The deal was never written into a single treaty, but what emerged from those negotiations was simple in its logic. Saudi oil revenues would flow back into American bonds. In exchange, America would protect the kingdom that pumped it. And from that agreement came something most people never fully see, a kind of invisible gravity that pulls every nation, every central bank, every energy market toward Washington, whether they like it or not. But here's what nobody's saying clearly enough. That gravity is weakening. Let's go back to 1971 for a moment. Because before you can understand what's ending, you need to understand what was built and why it was so elegant, so ruthless, and so durable. In August of that year, Richard Nixon did something that most Americans barely noticed at the time. He closed what was known as the gold window. Until that moment, any country in the world could walk up to the United States Treasury and exchange their dollars for gold at a fixed rate, $35 per ounce. That was the deal made at Bretton Woods in 1944, when America emerged from World War II as the only major economy still standing, with its factories intact and its soil untouched by bombs. The dollar was as good as gold, literally. But by 1971, that was no longer true. America had spent enormously on Vietnam, on the Great Society programs, on the sheer cost of projecting military power across the globe. Other countries, France most visibly among them, had started quietly converting their dollar reserves into gold. They could see the math didn't work. And when the math doesn't work, someone always blinks first. Nixon blinked. On the evening of August 15th, in a televised address that interrupted the most popular show on American television that Sunday night, he announced the suspension of dollar-gold convertibility. No international negotiation, no warning to allies, just a unilateral decision made over a weekend at Camp David with a small circle of advisors that effectively ended the Bretton Woods system that had governed global finance for nearly 3 decades. And for a moment, just a moment, the dollar looked genuinely vulnerable. If you couldn't exchange dollars for gold anymore, what exactly were they backed by? What gave them value? Why would any country continue to hold them in reserve? These were not academic questions. These were existential questions for American power. What followed wasn't a single dramatic agreement signed in a single room. That's the version that circulates on the internet, and it's too clean to be true. What actually happened between 1973 and 1974 was messier, more organic, and in some ways more interesting. The 1973 Arab oil embargo had sent shockwaves through every Western economy. Oil prices quadrupled almost overnight. Saudi Arabia was suddenly sitting on an unprecedented surplus of dollars, more than it could spend, more than its economy could absorb. And Washington was staring at a destabilized dollar, a humiliated foreign policy, and an energy crisis that had Americans waiting in lines for gasoline. The two countries needed each other, not ideologically, practically. What emerged from their negotiations in 1974 was a framework, part public, part secret, that would quietly reshape the global monetary order. The public piece was a joint economic cooperation commission. The secret piece, a diplomatic cable that wouldn't surface until Bloomberg filed a Freedom of Information request in 2016, was more consequential. Saudi Arabia would recycle its enormous oil revenues back into U.S. Treasury bonds. In exchange, America would provide military protection and equipment to the kingdom. No formal decree, no treaty requiring oil to be priced exclusively in dollars. Instead, something more powerful. A set of aligned incentives so strong, so mutually reinforcing, that they didn't need to be written into law. Because here's the thing about the petrodollar system that most people miss. It didn't spread because America forced it. It spread because it made sense. For oil producers, for trading nations, for central banks holding reserves. The dollar was stable, liquid, and universally accepted. Pricing oil in dollars meant you only needed one currency to operate in global energy markets. And because everyone used dollars for oil, everyone needed dollars for everything else too. The system became self-reinforcing in a way that no single agreement could have engineered. Think about what that meant in practice. Every nation on Earth needs energy. Every factory, every military, every hospital, every city runs on it. And if the dominant currency in which that energy is priced and traded is the dollar, then every nation on Earth has a structural reason to accumulate dollars. To hold American debt, to maintain dollar reserves. Not because Washington demanded it, because the architecture of global trade made it the rational choice. That's not coercion. That's something subtler and harder to dismantle. A system where every participant's self-interest points in the same direction. And from that convergence, America got something extraordinary. The ability to run deficits that would have broken any other economy. To borrow at rates no other nation could access. To fund its military, its universities, its technology sector, its entire global presence, on credit that the world was, for structural reasons, almost compelled to extend. It was one of the great geopolitical constructions of the modern era. Not because it was designed in a single moment of genius, but because it grew into something so deeply embedded in how the world worked that most people stopped seeing it at all, until the cracks started showing. For decades, the system held. Not perfectly, not without friction, but it held in the way that large, deeply embedded structures tend to hold, not because everyone inside them is happy, but because no one inside them has both the motivation and the power to build something different. That began to change in the early 2000s, and it didn't start with a rebellion, it started with a war. When the United States invaded Iraq in 2003, something shifted in the way the world's governments thought about dollar dependency. Not immediately, not loudly, but in the finance ministries and central banks of countries that had spent decades accumulating dollar reserves, a quiet question began to circulate. What happens if Washington decides to use the dollar as a weapon? It wasn't paranoia, it was pattern recognition. America had already shown, through decades of sanctions policy, that access to the dollar system could be revoked. Countries that fell out of favor with Washington found themselves cut off from dollar clearing, frozen out of international trade, strangled by financial isolation. Iran had lived this reality for years. Cuba had lived it for decades. The dollar wasn't just a currency, it was an infrastructure, and Washington controlled the switches. For most countries, that was an acceptable risk. The benefits of dollar integration outweighed the vulnerability. Global trade ran on dollars. Oil was priced in dollars. U.S. Treasury bonds were the safest, most liquid asset on the planet. The system worked. You stayed inside it. But for countries that considered themselves potential adversaries of the United States, or that simply valued strategic autonomy, the calculus was different. And after 2003, that list of countries started quietly getting longer. China was watching. Russia was watching. And both were beginning to ask a version of the same question. How do you build an exit? Russia moved first in its own way. After the 2014 annexation of Crimea and the sanctions that followed, Moscow began accelerating its de-dollarization strategy. It dumped a significant portion of its U.S. Treasury holdings. It built up gold reserves. It developed alternative payment infrastructure with China. It began settling more trade in rubles and yuan. These weren't dramatic moves. They were quiet, methodical, and easy to dismiss as symbolic at the time. Then came February 2022. When Russia invaded Ukraine, the Western response included something that hadn't been done before at that scale: the freezing of approximately $300 billion in Russian central bank reserves held in Western financial institutions. Not sanctions on trade, not asset seizures from oligarchs, the immobilization of a sovereign nation's central bank reserves. Assets that Russia had accumulated over decades, held in what was supposed to be neutral financial institutions, simply frozen. The message that sent, not to Russia, but to every other government watching, was impossible to ignore. If you hold your reserves in dollars, in euros, in Western financial institutions, those reserves are not truly yours. They exist at the pleasure of Washington and its allies. The moment your government does something that crosses a line, wherever that line happens to be drawn, those assets can disappear from your balance sheet overnight. In Beijing, that message landed with particular force. China holds trillions in dollar-denominated assets. It has spent decades integrating into the global dollar system, while simultaneously building the economic weight to potentially challenge it. And suddenly, the Russian example made the cost of that integration visible in a way that no amount of academic analysis had managed to do. The question was no longer theoretical. It was operational. How exposed are we, and what do we do about it? But China wasn't the only one paying attention. Across the global south, in countries that had spent generations navigating the complex politics of dollar dependency, the Russian reserve freeze accelerated a conversation that had been building for years. About the fairness of a system where one country controls the financial infrastructure that everyone else depends on. About the vulnerability of holding reserves in a currency that can be weaponized. About whether there was a different way to organize global trade. These conversations didn't produce immediate alternatives. Building financial infrastructure takes years. Trust between nations takes decades. The dollar's dominance isn't just structural, it's habitual, deeply embedded in the contracts, the systems, the institutional knowledge of every major trading economy on Earth. But something had changed. The willingness to at least explore alternatives, seriously, at the institutional level, not just as rhetorical defiance, was growing. And that willingness, once it takes root, is very hard to reverse.
The cracks weren't in the dollar itself. The dollar remained strong. U.S. Treasuries remained the world's preferred safe haven. The numbers, on the surface, still looked fine. The cracks were in the belief that the system was neutral, that it was simply infrastructure, like the internet or international shipping lanes, available to everyone on equal terms. That belief was gone. And once a belief like that is gone, the system it supported is never quite the same again. Here's where the story gets complicated. Because if you've been paying attention to the headlines over the past few years,
You've probably heard some version of the following. BRICS is rising. The dollar is dying. China and Russia are building a new financial system that will replace American dominance within a decade. You may have heard that Saudi Arabia is selling oil in Yuan, that central banks are dumping treasuries, that the petrodollar is already dead. Some of that is true, some of it is exaggerated. And sorting out which is which matters, because the gap between what's actually happening and what people think is happening is where the most important story lives. Let's start with China. China's challenge to dollar dominance is real, serious, and generational. But it's more methodical than dramatic, and it operates on a timeline that most Western commentary consistently underestimates. Beijing has been building financial infrastructure for over a decade. In 2015, it launched CIPS, the Cross-Border Interbank Payment System, a yuan-based alternative to the dollar clearing networks that dominate global finance. It has expanded its network of currency swap lines with dozens of central banks, allowing bilateral trade to be settled in yuan without touching the dollar. It has pushed, with some success, for yuan invoicing in commodity markets. And since 2022, it has absorbed much of Russia's redirected trade, deepening the bilateral financial relationship in ways that were unthinkable 5 years ago. But China faces a fundamental constraint that no amount of infrastructure can easily solve. The yuan is not freely convertible. Beijing controls its capital account. Foreign investors cannot freely move money in and out of China. And without that freedom, without the ability to hold yuan assets and exit them at will, no serious reserve manager, no global corporation, no major central bank is going to shift the core of its reserves into yuan. This isn't just a technical limitation, it's a political one, because freely convertible currencies require something China's government is not yet willing to provide: a degree of financial openness that would make the yuan genuinely international, but would also expose Beijing to the kind of capital flow volatility it has spent decades trying to insulate itself from. The result is a paradox at the heart of China's monetary ambitions. To make the yuan a true reserve currency, China would have to accept risks to financial stability that its leadership considers unacceptable. And until it accepts those risks, the yuan will remain a regional currency with global aspirations, significant, growing, but nowhere near ready to anchor the international monetary system. That doesn't mean China isn't making progress. It is. The yuan's share of global trade settlement has grown. CIPS processes a rising volume of transactions. More central banks hold yuan in their reserves than a decade ago. But the numbers remain modest in comparison to the scale of the ambition. According to the IMF's most recent data, the yuan accounts for just over 2% of global foreign exchange reserves. The dollar accounts for roughly 56%. That gap doesn't close in a decade. It might not close in 2.
Now let's talk about BRICS. The alliance, originally Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, now expanded to include Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, the United Arab Emirates, and Indonesia as confirmed full members, with Saudi Arabia conspicuously invited but not yet formally joined, has become the primary institutional vehicle for de-dollarization rhetoric.
Summits produce communiques about reducing dollar dependency. Leaders talk about a new reserve currency, a BRICS payment system, an alternative to SWIFT. But rhetoric and architecture are very different things. The fundamental problem with BRICS as a dollar alternative is that its members don't particularly trust each other. China and India share a contested border and have fought a war. Brazil and Russia have almost no natural economic complementarity. The interests of Gulf monarchies and a revolutionary Islamic republic don't align in any obvious way. Egypt and Ethiopia refused to sign a joint BRICS communiqué at a 2024 foreign ministers meeting, exposing fault lines that run far deeper than any shared interest in de-dollarization. The political and economic divergences within BRICS are vast, and building a monetary system requires a level of institutional trust and policy coordination that takes generations to develop. The euro took 50 years of European integration and still nearly fell apart in 2012. A BRICS currency, assuming it ever materialized, would face those coordination problems multiplied across far more divergent political systems, economic structures, and strategic interests. None of this means the dollar is safe forever. The challenges are real. The momentum is real. The structural grievances driving de-dollarization are real. But the death of the petrodollar system, if it comes, will not arrive as a sudden collapse. It will arrive as a long, slow erosion, a gradual shift in the gravitational field of global finance that unfolds over decades, not years. And that process is already underway. The question isn't whether it's happening, it is. The question is what it looks like when it's halfway done, and who benefits, and who gets hurt, in the space between the old order and whatever comes next.
Here's something that gets lost in most conversations about de-dollarization. The people who predict the dollar's imminent collapse tend to focus on its vulnerabilities. And those vulnerabilities are real. But they rarely spend equal time on the structural advantages that have kept the dollar dominant for 8 decades. Advantages that don't disappear just because the geopolitical landscape is shifting. Let's talk about what the dollar actually is. It isn't just a currency, it's an ecosystem. And ecosystems don't collapse overnight. They degrade at the edges, slowly, while the core holds longer than anyone expects. The first thing you need to understand is liquidity. The U.S. Treasury market is the largest, deepest, most liquid financial market on the planet. On any given day, trillions of dollars in Treasury securities change hands. That liquidity is not a minor convenience. It's a fundamental requirement for any asset that functions as a global reserve. When a crisis hits anywhere in the world, when a bank needs collateral, when a central bank needs to defend its currency, when a corporation needs to park cash safely overnight, the reflex is always the same. Buy treasuries, buy dollars. No other market on earth can absorb that kind of demand. The Eurozone has sovereign debt markets, but they're fragmented across 17 different issuers with 17 different credit profiles. German bunds and Greek bonds are not the same thing, and no one pretends they are. The Yuan market lacks the depth, the openness, and the institutional infrastructure to serve this function. Gold doesn't pay interest and can't be deployed at scale in a financial crisis. The dollar doesn't just win by default. It wins because it offers something genuinely irreplaceable at the scale global finance requires. The second advantage is institutional. The dollar is embedded in the legal, contractual, and operational infrastructure of global trade
in ways that take generations to unwind. Most commodity contracts are written in dollars. Most international loans are denominated in dollars. Most cross-border corporate transactions are settled in dollars. The SWIFT messaging system, through which the vast majority of international payments are routed, operates primarily in dollars. Changing any of these systems requires not just political will, but the rewriting of millions of contracts, the retraining of thousands of institutions, and the construction of alternative infrastructure that doesn't yet exist at meaningful scale. This is what economists mean when they talk about path dependency. The dollar is dominant not just because it's good, but because the entire world has organized itself around its dominance. Switching costs are enormous, and enormous switching costs create inertia that outlasts the political conditions that originally created the system. The third advantage is trust, and specifically the absence of a credible alternative. Trust in a reserve currency isn't just about the currency itself. It's about the legal system behind it, the property rights, the rule of law, the independence of the central bank, the predictability of policy. These are not things you can manufacture quickly. They accumulate over decades of institutional behavior, of crises navigated, of commitments honored. The Federal Reserve has made mistakes, serious ones. The inflation of the 1970s, the failures of 2008, the post-pandemic surge that took policymakers too long to address. But through all of it, the dollar remained. Because the alternative, holding reserves in a currency backed by a government that controls its courts, its media, its financial regulators, and its central bank, requires a different kind of trust. A trust that most reserve managers, when it comes down to it, are not yet prepared to extend to Beijing. This isn't an ideological point, it's a practical one. Reserve managers aren't making political statements, they're making risk assessments. And on the risk assessment, the dollar still wins. Not because it's perfect, but because the alternatives are more imperfect in ways that matter more. The fourth advantage is the network effect. The more countries use the dollar, the more valuable it is for every country to use the dollar. This is the same logic that keeps certain payment platforms dominant, certain operating systems entrenched, certain languages spoken long after the empires that spread them have collapsed. The dollar's network advantage is self-reinforcing in a way that no challenger has yet figured out how to break. None of this means the dollar is invulnerable. It isn't. The structural pressures are real, and they are building. But understanding the dollar's genuine strengths is essential to understanding what a realistic transition away from it would actually look like, and how long it would realistically take. Because here's the uncomfortable truth that both the dollar's defenders and its critics tend to avoid. The world doesn't need the dollar to collapse to be fundamentally transformed. It just needs the dollar to matter a little less, in a few more places, over a long enough period of time. A slow erosion of dollar primacy, from 60% of global reserves to 50, then to 40, over 2 or 3 decades, would reshape the global economy in ways that are just as profound as a sudden collapse, but far harder to see coming until you're already living inside the consequences. That erosion may already be underway, and the place where it's most visible, where the tectonic plates of the old order and the new are grinding directly against each other, is in the global energy market, which is exactly where this story began. For most of the petrodollar era, the energy market was the system's center of gravity. Oil moved in dollars. Every barrel, every contract, every futures trade. from the North Sea to the Persian Gulf, from the Gulf of Mexico to the Siberian steppe. The currency of global energy was the dollar, and that fact alone was enough to ensure that the dollar remained indispensable to every economy that needed to keep its lights on and its factories running. That is changing. Slowly, unevenly, incompletely, but unmistakably. The shift began quietly, in the margins of the global energy trade, long before most analysts were paying attention. China, which surpassed the United States as the world's largest oil importer in 2017, spent years laying the groundwork for a different kind of energy market. On March 26, 2018, it launched the Shanghai International Energy Exchange, the INE crude futures contract, denominated in Yuan. For the first time, there was a significant oil futures market that didn't require dollars. It wasn't an immediate revolution, but it was infrastructure, and infrastructure, once built, tends to get used. Then came the geopolitical acceleration. Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022 and the Western sanctions that followed effectively forced Moscow to redirect its enormous energy exports away from Europe and toward Asia. Russia began selling oil and gas to China and India at significant discounts, and crucially, in non-dollar currencies: rubles, yuan, rupees, bilateral settlement mechanisms that bypass the dollar clearing system entirely. The scale of this shift was significant. Russia was, before the invasion, one of the world's largest energy exporters. Redirecting that volume of trade outside the dollar system didn't just affect Russia and its buyers. It demonstrated, at real scale, that the dollar could be bypassed in energy trade. Not easily, not without cost, but it could be done. India's response to this situation was particularly instructive. India is not a geopolitical adversary of the United States. It is, in many ways, a strategic partner. But when Russia offered oil at steep discounts to market price, discounts that varied significantly over time, but were substantial enough in the early months of the war to represent a compelling economic opportunity, India bought it. And in significant volumes, it bought it in rupees and yuan, not dollars. Russian crude, which accounted for less than 1% of India's oil imports before the invasion, rose to cover roughly 40% of total Indian oil imports in the years that followed, saving New Delhi an estimated $17 billion, according to Reuters. Because at that price differential, the cost of working around the dollar system was worth paying. This is the logic that de-dollarization optimists understand, and that dollar defenders sometimes underestimate. De-dollarization doesn't require ideological commitment. It doesn't require countries to decide they hate America. It just requires the economic incentive to become large enough that the friction of using alternative systems is worth tolerating. And that incentive is increasingly being manufactured deliberately by Russia, by China, by any actor with an interest in demonstrating that dollar alternatives can work in practice, not just in theory. Saudi Arabia added another layer to this story in January 2023, when Finance Minister Mohammed Al-Jadaan told Bloomberg Television at the World Economic Forum in Davos that the kingdom was open to discussing oil trade settlements in currencies other than the dollar. His exact words were careful. "There are no issues with discussing how we settle our trade arrangements, whether it is in the US dollar, whether it is the euro, whether it is the Saudi riyal." It was not a dramatic announcement. It was framed as commercial flexibility rather than political realignment. But in the context of the petrodollar system, where the entire architecture rested on the assumption that Gulf oil would always be priced and settled in dollars, even the suggestion of flexibility was significant. It was the first time in nearly 5 decades that a senior Saudi official had publicly opened that door. Saudi Arabia has not abandoned the dollar. Let's be precise about that. The overwhelming majority of Saudi oil is still traded in dollars. The kingdom's financial system remains deeply integrated with American institutions. The security relationship between Riyadh and Washington, while strained, remains structurally intact. But the signal sent by even the possibility of non-dollar oil settlements, what analysts have started calling the petro-yuan, was heard clearly in every finance ministry in the world. The conversation had shifted. The assumption of dollar universality in energy markets, which had held for 5 decades, was now openly in question. Meanwhile, the broader energy transition adds another dimension to this story that is easy to miss. As the world gradually shifts toward renewable energy, solar, wind, batteries, electric vehicles, the structural role of oil in the global economy will change. Not disappear, not quickly. Oil will remain essential for decades. But as its centrality diminishes, so too does the particular advantage the dollar derives from being the currency of oil. A world that runs primarily on electricity generated from solar panels doesn't need a petrodollar. It needs whatever currency dominates the supply chains for solar panels, batteries, rare earth minerals, and the grid infrastructure that connects them. And those supply chains, as of today, run overwhelmingly through China. This is the deeper geopolitical logic behind China's extraordinary investment in renewable energy manufacturing. It isn't just industrial policy. It isn't just climate strategy. It's a long-term play for the kind of structural currency advantage that oil gave the United States for 50 years. Whether it succeeds depends on factors that no one can fully predict: the pace of the energy transition, the evolution of battery technology, the geopolitics of critical mineral supply chains, the response of Western governments to Chinese industrial dominance in clean energy. But the direction is clear. The energy market that anchored the petrodollar system is being reorganized. Not overnight, not completely, but in ways that, taken together, amount to something more than incremental change. The era in which a single commodity, traded in a single currency, provided the gravitational foundation for the entire global monetary order, that era is ending. What comes next is not yet clear, but it is being built right now in the decisions being made in Beijing and Riyadh and New Delhi and Moscow and Brussels. In the contracts being written, the infrastructure being laid, the alliances being formed. And the shape of what comes next will determine the economic reality of the next 50 years, in ways that most people, busy with their lives, their jobs, their daily concerns, will not see coming until they're already living inside it. So where does this leave us? We've traveled a long road together in this video, from a Sunday night in August 1971, when Nixon walked up to a camera and quietly ended the world's monetary order, through the organic architecture of the petrodollar system, not a conspiracy, but something more durable than a conspiracy, a set of aligned incentives so powerful they organized the entire global economy for 50 years. Through the cracks appearing in that system, the weaponization of reserves, the rise of China, the fragmentation of BRICS, the energy pivot happening right now in the contracts and pipelines and payment systems that most people never think about. And we've arrived at a question that doesn't have a clean answer. Not yet. what actually comes next. Before I get into that, if you've made it this far in this video with me, I want to say something directly. What we cover here at Meridian Theory isn't breaking news. It isn't hot takes. It's the kind of analysis that takes time to build, layer by layer, because the world doesn't actually run on headlines. It runs on systems. And systems take time to understand. If that's the kind of content that matters to you, subscribe to this channel, hit the bell, because we're just getting started, and the conversations ahead are going to go even deeper than this one. Now, back to the question that should be keeping every serious analyst up at night. The honest answer is that no single currency is positioned to replace the dollar. Not the yuan, not a BRICS basket, not gold, not a central bank digital currency, not any instrument currently in existence. What is more likely, and what the evidence actually points toward, is something messier and more disorienting than a clean replacement. A fragmentation, a world of monetary blocks where different regions settle trade in different currencies depending on their geopolitical alignment, where the dollar remains dominant in the Western Hemisphere and among U.S. allies, while the yuan grows in importance across Asia and parts of Africa and the Middle East, where commodity trade, particularly energy, gradually diversifies into multiple currencies depending on who is buying and who is selling. This isn't a future. It's already the present, in embryonic form. And here's what that means in practice for the United States. A world of monetary fragmentation is not the same as a world of dollar collapse. America doesn't wake up one morning to find its currency worthless. What happens instead is slower, subtler, and in some ways harder to address. The dollar's premium, the exorbitant privilege, as French Finance Minister Valéry Giscard d'Estaing called it in the 1960s, begins to erode. America's cost of borrowing rises, modestly at first, then more significantly. The ability to run large deficits without triggering inflation narrows. The political tool of financial sanctions becomes less effective as more of the world builds infrastructure to root around it. None of this happens quickly, but all of it is directional. And direction, sustained over decades, is what reshapes the world. There's a deeper question underneath all of this, though, one that economists rarely ask because it doesn't fit neatly into their models. What is money, actually? Not in the technical sense, in the human sense. Money is a collective agreement. It's a story that enough people believe in that it becomes real. The dollar's power was never just about oil or military force or treasury markets. It was about a shared belief, held by billions of people across dozens of countries, that the dollar was the language of global commerce, that you could take it anywhere, that it would hold its value, that it was the closest thing the world had to a neutral medium of exchange. That belief is intact, but it is no longer unquestioned. And once a belief of that magnitude begins to be questioned, once the question is on the table, something has permanently changed. The conversation itself is the signal. The petrodollar era is not ending with a bang. It's ending the way most historical transitions actually end, not with a single dramatic rupture, but with a long, slow accumulation of small decisions, alternative arrangements, and quiet realignments that only look inevitable in retrospect. We are living inside that accumulation right now. There's a moment in the life of every great system when it stops being a choice and becomes a condition. When the rules of the game become the game itself.
when the infrastructure of power becomes so embedded in daily life that no one inside it can imagine anything different. When the question, why does it work this way, stops being asked because the answer seems too obvious to need saying. The petrodollar system reached that moment sometime in the 1980s, and it stayed there for 40 years. Entire generations of economists were trained inside it. Entire foreign policies were built around it. Entire national development strategies were constrained by it, or liberated by it, depending on where you sat. The world's financial architecture, its trade routes, its military alliances, its sanctions regimes, its commodity markets, all of it grew up around the assumption that the dollar was the center of gravity, permanent, inevitable, simply the way things are. And now, quietly, that assumption is being stress tested in ways it has never been stress tested before. Not by a single rival, not by a single crisis, but by the slow, cumulative weight of a world that has spent decades absorbing the costs of dollar dependency and is now, for the first time, building the infrastructure to imagine something different. That infrastructure is incomplete. The alternatives are fragmented. The challengers are divided among themselves. The dollar remains, by every serious measure, the dominant currency in global finance, and will remain so for years, perhaps decades to come. But something has shifted. Not in the numbers, not yet in any way that shows up cleanly in a chart or a quarterly report. It has shifted in the conversation, in the willingness of governments that would never have said this 10 years ago, to ask openly whether there is another way. That shift matters because systems don't change when the alternative is ready. They change when the belief in the old way begins to falter. When the people inside the system stop defending it because it's right and start defending it because changing it is hard. Those are different things, and history knows the difference. Think about what we've covered in this video. A deal made in secret, never formally written down, that wired the global economy for 50 years. A system that grew not from design, but from incentive, and held not from force, but from the rational self-interest of nearly every nation on earth. A weaponization of that system that made its costs visible in a way no academic paper ever could. A set of challengers that are real but fragmented, ambitious but constrained. An energy market quietly reorganizing itself around new geographies, new currencies, new supply chains. And underneath all of it, a question about the nature of money itself, and whether the story we've been telling about the dollar is still one the world believes. None of this resolves cleanly. That's not intellectual weakness. That's intellectual honesty. The future of the global monetary order is genuinely uncertain in ways that should make anyone who claims certainty suspect.
What we can say is this. The era that began in the wreckage of Bretton Woods was consolidated in the oil fields of the Arabian Peninsula and reached its apex in the unipolar moment after the Cold War. That era is in transition. Not ended, not replaced, but no longer the only story being told. And the next era, whatever it turns out to be, will be shaped by decisions being made right now, by the engineers building payment infrastructure in Beijing, by the finance ministers quietly diversifying away from treasuries in Riyadh and New Delhi, by the policymakers in Washington who either understand what is happening and respond with strategic clarity, or mistake the absence of crisis for the presence of stability, by the analysts and citizens and voters who understand what money actually is, not a neutral fact of life, but a political construction, subject to revision, capable of transformation, built and maintained by human choices that can always, in principle, be made differently. The petrodollar era is ending. Not today, not tomorrow, but the direction is set. The only real question left is whether the transition will be managed, or whether it will simply happen to people who weren't paying attention. You were paying attention. If this kind of analysis matters to you, share this video with 5 people who should be asking these questions but aren't. Leave a comment below, not just "great video," but something real. Tell me what you think is actually going to happen. Tell me what we got wrong. Tell me what question you want us to go deeper on next, because the next episode is already taking shape, and the world isn't waiting.